This is the first time I've given a presentation about war stories. I like the idea, but as it being the first time, it's a bit experimental. So you may have to bear with me here, but I'll give it a try and try to make it interesting for you. First off, since it's about war stories of the past, I will start pretty much at the beginning. And I came into this business, into the fraud management business, from the AI business. I was working for a small company that was working on the applications of neural networks and had been for some years before we approached the fraud problem. So my background comes from the machine learning AI side of the business into the fraud business. But before there was any machine learning or fancy mathematics being used in fraud detection. So fortunately, I just stumbled into being at the beginning of that whole process and have pretty much stayed with it since then. That's about 30 years. So I thought I would do things roughly in chronological order. So first off, one of the issues we ran into in the early days of trying to detect credit card fraud with machine learning techniques was that everybody in the industry was trying to come up with some sort of model or some sort of filter they could use to detect fraudulent transactions. At that time, fraud was much higher than it is today in terms of percentages. And it was threatening the industry because secondary market investors were beginning to question credit cards as to whether they really were going to be a good product in the long run because of the increasing fraud rates. Turns out it wasn't really as much of a threat as it seemed, but it was enough of a threat to propel our business. So all sorts of folks tried to produce solutions. Los Alamos National Labs, Sandia National Labs in the US, Experian, FICO, Accenture, all of them created models, but they all had poor detection or overly high false positive rates. Fortunately, we had been working in an area looking for a commercial application of our defense and intelligence technology using neural networks. And we stumbled into this problem. And as it happened, we ended up with a good solution. But initially, we didn't do very well. We tried to solve the problem by detecting fraudulent transactions directly. And it turned out there just wasn't enough data to build a good model that had enough variables into it to really do a good job. There were more frauds than today, but certainly nowhere near enough to build a direct model. Finally, because we were working on some other things for categorization of consumers using lifestyle information, we realized that we were pretty good at being able to look at normal behavior and figure out what individual accounts or account holders would be doing under normal conditions. So it dawned on us that the approach to the problem really was to not try and detect fraud, but to detect genuine or the absence of genuine. And that led us to the idea of building profiles. And it turned out that sophisticated profiles of the past behavior of accounts are much more important than anything having to do with machine learning. Whether you use a neural network or a regression model or a random forest makes much less difference than the quality of the profiling you use to represent the past history of an account. So in those early days, we had selected the wrong problem. The problem we originally started with was detecting frauds. And it turned out that the better solution was to try and detect genuine and recognize frauds when the genuine wasn't there. Secondly, as time went on, we still had plaguing problems with false positive rates being too high. And to solve that difficulty, we kept finding that we had trouble after a fraud had occurred. Our models did a poor job of figuring out which subsequent transactions were fraud or not fraud. And as a result, that brought our statistics or performance on detecting fraud down a lot because we made mistakes on all those second and third frauds. But as we looked at the problem more closely, we recognized that that wasn't really the issue. The way that our operators, the issuers that were using the system, made their decisions, they acted on the account. The question was whether to block the account or not to worry about the individual transaction so much. So we changed the variable used to train the models. And we made that variable, instead of, is this transaction a fraud? We made it, has this account been defrauded or will be defrauded by this transaction or prior transactions? When we use that as the target variable in training our models, performance increased substantially. And today, even in the market as we see it now, some of the one of the keys to some of the better fraud detection systems are that they use that kind of a target variable when training their models, as opposed to just trying to train them on fraud versus non-fraud. You'll find nearly all new data scientists, even very good ones, who come to the fraud problem usually make that mistake of trying to directly detect fraud versus non-fraud transactions, when that's not really what the operator needs to know, and it's not really the problem that we can solve well. So the trick is to recognize how the problem fits into the overall operation. And data scientists and engineers building these systems need to look beyond the specific tasks they're given by a business person to recognize how this thing fits in the overall scheme of things. So let's see, the next problem I had, the next war story was about some large frauds. So the FraudCON system was doing pretty well, detecting fraud, typically reducing fraud by about half or 2/3 at most locations where it was implemented correctly, spread across the country and then across the US and then across the world rather quickly. But one of the difficulties we had that was very embarrassing was all of a sudden we had a bunch of frauds on transactions that were well over $100,000. Now those are unusual for credit card transactions. And I'm going to stick largely to credit cards because that's where I have the most experience. But there's, of course, many of these lessons apply elsewhere. But as we were looking at these particular big frauds that occurred, our models didn't flag them as all risky. So you see a transaction come through for $250,000 and the model says, oh, that's fine. Well, the reason is that in the data, the only very large transactions the models had ever seen in training were ones that were legitimate, mostly from the Sultan of Brunei and several of similar folks. And so these very large transactions that the banks accommodated because these were important customers, all were non-frauds. So the system figured that probably not a fraud when it sees a huge transaction. So the fraudsters that had the guts and creativity to try whopping big transactions were winning. And even for cash transactions, they were doing pretty well. Well, of course, the solution was to improve the model. There are two ways to do that. One is called hinting, where you make up false transactions and say that they were frauds and help train the model on that so it sees these outliers as being dangerous. And the other way is to build some rules, just treating transactions over a certain amount in a special way. And the best solution actually is to build a model that represents or detects, estimates the reliability of your detection model. When we deal with models from a mathematical perspective, we think in terms of like high school algebra. A model is a function, you put some numbers in, crunch on it, and the number comes out the back end. And normally functions are defined over all real numbers, that any numbers you stick in on the front end will result in something sensible on the back end. Not true for models. For models, the domain of the function is fuzzy. It's not all real numbers or all integers or something like that, and as you would have in a typical algebra problem in high school. It is more or less has edges based on the experience of the model as shown in its data. So as a consequence, the reliability of a model will be different under different sets of circumstances, and you can actually build a pretty good model to determine its reliability. So a model about the model is the most sophisticated and the most lasting solution to that problem of the giant frauds. We also had a problem with little tiny frauds. So it turns out that some of the transactions that we saw at one of the biggest processors in the world were very small. We had thousands and thousands of fraudulent transactions that were about $1 or even less. And they would go right through the system with no flags for frauds at all. And as we researched the problem, which became a multi-million-dollar problem over a course of just several days, because thousands of accounts were being defrauded with hundreds of thousands of these tiny transactions. And the issuer or the processor had no way to stop them because there were lots of small transactions that were genuine, so they couldn't just put a rule saying if it's small, stop it. They had to allow them through, and it was getting pretty expensive. So we discovered that in the data we were using to train the model, there were no frauds that were small. And the reason? The operators decided that a fraud that was under a couple bucks wasn't worth recording. So they didn't spend their time messing around with it. And as a result, it never appeared in the data as a fraud. So in the model's experience, there were no small frauds. Likewise, a small fraud, even if they were in the data, a small fraud on an individual account didn't mean much. And the model might tolerate it without any, reasonably so. However, when you look across the whole system, when you see thousands of these every minute, you realize that something's unusual. So the solution was, of course, to build a model that looked at the whole portfolio's behavior as well as the individual transaction on the individual account. It turned, surprisingly, very few systems in use today have that capability. So if you're dealing with a system that is a big payment system, whether it be credit cards or it be something like Zelle or Venmo, any of those kinds of systems, you need to make sure that you also have models about how the system is behaving, not just how the individual account is behaving, because some types of fraud attack the system, not the individual account. There's another thing along the same line. We had a circumstance a few years ago where in one very large country, multiple processors and issuers all of a sudden were having accounts that were defrauded in very large amounts. The transactions were relatively modest, but the totals were huge. And the reason was that a vendor to all of these organizations had a particular nefarious family working for them. And that family had figured out that they could go in and tweak the credit limits on a bunch of credit card accounts. And as a result, they raised the credit limits to millions of dollars. So usually you just pick the highest number that the database could store for that value. And the models had been built so that they scaled the size of the transaction to the credit limit. And as the transactions got closer to the credit limit, the models got much more sensitive, much more likely to claim a fraud. Well, that was a mistake because, as it turned out, if you change the limit, all of a sudden transactions that normally would look very risky looked very ordinary. And as a consequence, we ended up with several $1 million per day flowing out of these systems as a result of these fraudulent transactions on very high credit limits. The solution was, of course, to go fix the credit limits, which took hundreds of hours and essentially a manual operation across multiple issuers and processors throughout this one country. We did eventually track down the source of the insiders involved. Of course, they, as individuals, had disappeared, but at least we could see what systems they touched and know which ones to go fix. So we fixed the credit limits, but the broader solution was twofold. One was to make the models so that they depended on fewer of the account parameters and more on the account's behavior from the past to recognize the scale of transactions as a result, so that nobody could just change one number and change the model's overall behavior. And secondly was to go back and again, build a system-wide model that could recognize that the whole portfolio was behaving strangely. That for any individual account, it may not seem all that risky, but the overall flow of funds out of the portfolio was ridiculously high and growing rapidly. So that systemic model, again, missing in many of today's operating systems, that systemic model can have some real value. Now let's see if I got another war story here. Oh, here's one that is even a little more technical. So you'll often hear about point of compromise detection, tracing back frauds to try and find the point of compromise where key data was stolen or compromised. And everybody talks about doing this trace back after frauds were detected. MasterCard and Visa talk about doing it, processors talk about doing it, so on, but almost nobody does for two reasons. One, it's a huge computing task to go back and look at all the past transactions on frauds and see where they crisscross, where they have common prior activity. That's a big computing problem. But secondly, usually once you find it, it's too late to do anything about it. So knowing that, we designed a really clever scheme to look at transactions at a given, say, ATM, could be another type of terminal, But at a given ATM, we look at the transactions and see if those transactions, the recent transactions, had common elements that in the past that looked suspiciously overlapping. Because you don't normally expect the 5 people in a row going to an ATM machine to all have a particular common transaction or a common prior merchant in their background, unless that merchant's right near the ATM. So we used a very clever scheme to recognize this in real time and flag those transactions that had suspicious common prior activity compared to other transactions at the same terminal where cash is being taken out. And it worked great at very low false positive rate, a very high detection rate, very good solution, except when we went and tried it in the most important place that we had in the world at that time. The riskiest ATMs in the world were in the Bangkok airport. And there's a whole bank of them giving out cash. And they were just defrauded right and left all the time. In fact, that was one of the first places where fraudsters were able to actually get into the guts of the ATM and change its programming in order to facilitate their frauds. So it was a real hot spot, but an important spot because people arriving in Thailand wanted to have some money to spend. So we used our new system there, but it turned out it was creating a lot of false positives. And it took us a little while to figure out what was really going on. It turned out that the culprit was church groups. We found that if a bunch of people from a local church somewhere in Poughkeepsie arrived on a plane, and then they all stood in line to use their credit cards to pull money out of the ATM machine or debit cards, that they all had these prior transactions in their history, and it looked very suspicious that one after another, they would have prior transactions that were a long ways away from the point of cash withdrawal. So we had this problem of very high false positives on these particular groups. So the trick was to initially, our solution was simply on the first verification call back to the account holder. When the first one we got a hold of an account holder in that cluster, we would ask them if they were traveling with a group. And if they said yes, we would then ignore the transactions, consider them no longer suspicious. Of course, as you might imagine, the fraudsters figured that out as well. So they started saying, oh, yes, we're all traveling together. We all come from the same place. So one solution was to try and quiz them further to see if they really knew where that place was, or what the local baseball team was, or something like that. But that was a pretty ham-handed solution and didn't work very well because the fraudsters got smarter and smarter about it. But the better solution was actually to scan the prior transactions of a bunch of cards in that cluster and look for any airline tickets. Not everybody in that group would have bought their airline tickets with the particular card being used, but very often some of them would have. And so once we saw one of those air tickets with that group, we ignored the cluster as no longer risky. So that's another example of the kind of thing we ran into in practice. So let's jump ahead to the current war story. Some of the lessons that we've learned from these activities are twofold, or severalfold. One, there's never enough data. We are nowhere near having enough data to build the kind of models that we could build using modern machine learning technology. In fact, the technology really hasn't changed too much in the last couple decades, but the ability to deal with large quantities of data has proven very effective, and models that are much more complicated than we would ever have tried a couple of 20 years ago, using the same technique but compounded over and over, are very successful today. We don't have enough data to use those techniques, though, when we're dealing with fraud. And especially when we're dealing with fraud at a particular institution or a particular operator. When we deal with it at the level of a processor that has a bunch of institutions, that helps a bit and we get a bit more data. But we're nowhere near enough to be able to fully utilize the technology at hand. Ultimately, the big mistake we made, the war story of all war stories when it comes to fraud detection, was we sold the detection system to the wrong people. It really should have been sold to the industry as a whole, to the payment network, or to a government agency, somebody who had an industry view. As a result of that mistake made 30 years ago, we are still suffering with much higher fraud losses than we should have. We're suborning a criminal industry that has lots of other bad habits besides just fraud. And those fraudsters attack each of us one after the other, each of us having to resolve the same puzzle over and over again and paying the fraudsters for the privilege each time we have to repeat that. Sharing information at a conference or on a phone call or an email to one another is not enough. We need to share mountains of data to detect fraud accurately. Some efforts have been made toward this, but they so far have not been successful. It's a very tricky problem to bring the industry together to cooperate. It's tricky in aligning incentives as well as maintaining appropriate privacy and so on. But I think there are ways to do it. It's just we have to put our minds to it. And there's been the incorrect assumption by large operators that because of their size, they have a basic advantage. They have more data than others and they can spend more money on fraud detection. So they have a competitive advantage. It turns out that they have a slight competitive advantage, but they also have a greater competitive advantage if they share their data, because it then shows them those areas where they're not seeing transactions, which are the ones where they're going to grow. So that if they want to grow, at being large, they have more opportunity to grow than others generally. They can accelerate that growth by having a more complete view of the risks in the areas where they're not transacting yet, but hope to soon, different categories of customers, different parts of the world, different kinds of transactions. So there's been this false competitive pressure for the big guys to not want to cooperate with the little guys, despite talking about fraud being an industry problem and so on. There hasn't been the action. We need to change that. And we need to change that for the good, not just of our institutions, but of our societies as well. Likewise, within individual organizations, it's important that we break down some of the barriers. Today, there's a tendency for data science teams to get some specific assignment from a business leader. I need a fraud model that detects this. And the data science team goes off and solves that particular problem. But we found in the little war stories I've given, the main solution generally wasn't building a particular model for a particular problem. It was figuring out what's the right problem to solve. And so if you define the problem correctly so that it fits within the overall operating system of how the transactions are managed and how accounts are managed, that's much more effective than trying to solve some specific problem. And very often the data scientists can bring insights into a better way to define the problem that better fits the tools we have. We have hammers, so we need to look for some nails. And occasionally we have a screwdriver and we need to look for screws. But we shouldn't just hand the data science team bolts or nuts and say, use these. We need to let them be part of the determination of the problem. And for that to happen, we need to break down the barriers between data science and operating groups. The data scientists need to learn the business in detail. Oftentimes there'll be somebody buried in the data science group that understands the data well, but they may or may not really understand the operations well. So in any event, that is my bit of war stories for now. Again, my name is Ted Crooks. I still consult in this area and have been an independent consultant for about 12 years now, and look forward to chatting with you. And if any of you have a question or something you just want to chew over, I'm quite happy to hear about it. Send me an email, and it's not necessarily a business arrangement. I'm interested in what's going on in fraud and happy to share some past insights. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take care.